So you're all very welcome to our last input on the Connect and Learn series with the Dublin City North Children and Young People's Committee. We're very pleased to bring this presentation and this online input to you today. Again, it is with Christina Enright, and Christina was with us last week and was talking through working with practical approaches to supporting young children under the age of 11. And today she's going to follow up on that with some practical approaches to working with adolescents who have been traumatized. My name is Christina Mahoney, and if any of you don't know me, you can certainly get my contact details after the event today. If you do have any questions, we'll ask you just to put it into the chat box, which is on the bottom of your screen, and we will give some good time at the end, about 15 minutes after Christina's input of an hour, into the Q&A. So without further ado, I do want to give Christina as much time as she can possibly get on this. Many of you will know Christina has been a psychotherapist for over the last 16 years, and she has worked with many children, adolescents, parents, foster parents, etc. over those years, working with the NHS and with TUSLA Child and Family Agency. And she has a specific interest in trauma and in development and attachment. So we're delighted to welcome her here again today, and I won't interrupt anymore. So Christina, I'm going to hand over to you, and just again to remind people to please make sure they are on mute and that their cameras are off, and we will make the recording available at the end. Thank you very much, Christina. Over to you.
Thank you, Christina. So good morning to all of you. Well, it's afternoon now, isn't it? You're all very welcome to this webinar on supporting traumatized teenagers to build resilience. So I'm just going to kind of get straight into it because of time. We haven't got a great deal of time to talk about such a broad subject. But we'll just outline some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. So we look at how developmental trauma negatively impacts on a child or an adolescent's capacities and resources and interferes with what's a really significant developmental stage. I'll just kind of touch on that. I'll talk about practical approaches that are effective supporting traumatized teenagers that helps them to develop a sense of empowerment and resilience. And this is particularly key during this developmental stage. And I'll look with you at creative ways to educate young people about how their brain and their nervous system operates. This psychoeducation approach is absolutely key to help young people to understand what's going on within their own minds and their own brains and their own bodies. And I'll touch on ways of talking to adolescents about their behavior in a way that will encourage them to become more curious about themselves rather than to shut down in defensiveness, and through that to become more self-reflective and to avoid a sense of feeling criticized. And also helping adolescents to recognize their strengths and talents. And we'll have some time, as Christina said, for some questions towards the end. So I just want to start off with you talking about a piece of qualitative research I was involved in many years ago when I worked in the UK. At that time, I worked for an organisation called Kids Company. It was a charity. And we worked basically at street level with highly vulnerable teenagers and children and families. And these were often children and families that didn't engage with mainstream services like mental health, social services, and some of these children were not even in education. So there was there were lots of challenges about engaging and working with this client group, generally with statutory services. And having a street level centre meant that people would actually self-refer and they would come. And a service that was set up very much at a community level that wasn't, I guess, formal in its approach, and there didn't need to be a formal referral service, meant that these clients felt safe and engaging. And so we developed in the organization what we called a therapeutic key worker role. And the idea was that we would help key workers to somehow take on and learn and develop themselves using the theory of therapy, of therapeutic thinking, of therapeutic practice, but actually in a key working role. And it turned out to be a very effective way of working. because many of these children and young people and parents were unable to engage with traditional formal psychotherapy. And so Alessandra Lima, who was a professor of psychology at the Enright Centre, undertook this piece of research for us. Some interesting findings that I think are relevant to any practitioners working with adolescents in any particular context. So we know that attachment is really important to all of us, not just for vulnerable children and adolescents, but it was found through the research looking at the impact of the key working relationship with these adolescents was that the attachment relationship formed as it would with a supportive parent became the building block for the minds of providing the building blocks of the minds of the teenagers, and through provision of warmth and consistency and reliability and a supportive relationship with the key worker, which was an important part of their development. And feeling accepted unconditionally was something that the young people talked about, that the key worker was there, that stuck by them no matter what. That was a very important experience for them to be able to move towards recovery from their trauma. And through this experience of building trust in with these adults, there was provided an opportunity to re-enter the non-traumatizing world of relationships, whereas prior relationships may have been very traumatizing, even in the family system. So here were these young people who had an opportunity to build relationships that were based on respect and care and support and acceptance. To have those prior experiences of traumatic relationships, or relational trauma, refers to the experience of what we used to call reparative relationships, and somebody that was there for the young person through thick and thin. And also it was identified that the key worker functioned as a primary object that understood, anticipated, and contained the both emotional needs of the adolescent, but also the ego needs. So it was providing this sort of mirroring experience that the adolescents may not have had, very often hadn't had in infancy and through early childhood, as a way of repairing and repairing the impact of the trauma of that, but also to address some of those unmet needs. And there were opportunities for challenging the implicit assumptions that the teenagers carried about themselves and other people, and how they impacted on how they were in the world. And I'll talk about that a bit later on, because I think it's a very important part of working with traumatized children and teenagers. And the key worker was a role model and a motivational figure to help young people who had a sense of despair or perhaps disempowerment, or a lack of motivation, a lack of awareness about the potential, that their future could be different from their past, and that they could achieve something, they could find their strengths and feel good about themselves. And having someone to look to believe in their potential was a key part of that. It's really about, when you can't see the value in yourself, and you can't see that you have all these strengths, you see, all you see are weaknesses, or a lack of resilience, or perhaps you might see yourself as being bad even. Having somebody reflect a different experience back to you of yourself is absolutely vital for your recovery. And there was a rekindling of hope for these clients through the key worker holding optimism about their capacity to be able to recover and to move through. And it's interesting because that's been demonstrated in other pieces of research, that if we believe that people can change, that things can be different for them, if we hold that in our minds as practitioners, then actually the opportunities and the potential for change increases. And these young people talked about being powerful in their minds, and I thought it was really interesting, because they were often, very vulnerable in the sense of not being able to regulate stress or many difficult situations of conflict, but they were often quite violent. We worked with a lot of teenagers in gangs, and there was a lot of high risk around them, both to them in terms of being hurt by other people in the community, but also hurting other people themselves. So experiencing that power in their minds to be able to kind of think differently, and the change of perception that we saw was really key. And then one other thing that came from the research, which I think it's really significant for all of us as practitioners, is to recognize that, you know, we all come from an experience of being children and being parented. And we may have our own ghosts, we may have experienced our own trauma. And so we may carry the ghosts of that through our childhood into our adulthood. And it's key that we understand that as adults, because that is going to be re-triggered. It's likely to be re-triggered by working or from working with young people who are traumatized. And when we know that and recognize that, it enables us to be more available emotionally to young people. We can withstand the stress of the work much better. And it enables us to feel more resilient as we continue in the midst of the challenges of working with highly traumatized teenagers. So we know from research for many, many years that the journey into adolescence and through adolescence involves a really unique developmental stage. So, you know, hopefully if a child has had good foundational experiences through care and through being protected and being nurtured, that the building blocks of the brain will be in place. And we know the brain develops from the base upwards, starting with the most primitive parts into the emotional center, which is in the limbic system, and then the prefrontal cortex develops after about 18 months into up to about 25, 30. And so during adolescence, there's a whole reorganization of the brain. So we have a repruning process, is how it's described in the brain research, from about 13 to 25. And neuroscientists talk about a use it or lose it rule. Similarly to infancy and early childhood, if your brain is not receiving the stimulation and the input that it needs, then it doesn't develop those networks, or those networks don't strengthen around those experiences. And during adolescence, because you're progressing through a new stage in life, you know, early infancy and early childhood and through to middle childhood is all about, you know, building lots of connections through neurons connecting at synapses, and then the reinforcing of those connections through networks to enable learning. There's a lot of learning during that stage about being in the world and how to live in the world and how to make sense of experiences you're having. When a child moves into adolescence, then it becomes about reorganization. So all of the networks that have been in place from early childhood, if they've been reinforced, have been strengthened. But because the brain needs to become more efficient, in order to operate into adulthood, then there's a pruning off of networks that are not needed or not used. And so if adolescents are not having positive experiences and empowering experiences, then those networks aren't reinforced. They could be lost. If all their experiences are, for example, around self-protection and managing danger, then those are the networks that will actually be strengthened and reinforced. And then there's myelination of those networks to make the brain become more efficient and to work faster. So what's often been put down to hormones in the adolescent brain and body, and on all of those challenging times that adolescents can experience, and those particular emotions can be thought about also as some of the brain changes that are taking place. And during this stage, there's a deepening, a kind of expansion of the development of abstract thinking, whereas young children think more concretely. In adolescence, there's this opportunity to begin to see the world in a much more kind of shades of grey way, that things aren't set in stone and that there are different ways of thinking thinking about things. And so the sophistication of an adolescent's thinking becomes more apparent. And this creates an important opportunity to help adolescents to be able to think about themselves and their lives and what's come before and what might be ahead of them. So there's a wonderful opportunity, because the brain's reorganizing, for an adolescent to be able to move forward in their lives in a way that might be different from their past experiences. And of course, there's development of the body and the secondary sexual characteristics and sexual identity, which involves curiosity around sex and relationships that are related to sexual intimacy and sexual experimentation. All of those are very much natural parts of that developmental stage, and are driven very much biology, but are mediated by psychology. And that's why some of the risky behaviors we can see in adolescents need to be carefully thought about. And we know that adolescents need a lot more sleep, because the brain is reorganizing as much as 10 hours a night, and readjusting the adult world around that is very important for them. So some other aspects of adolescent development is the need for separation and individuation from the adult world. So the idea of developing independence and autonomy around issues of power. So it's not that adolescents don't need their families or parents anymore, but they need to kind of separate enough to develop their own identity and their own sense of empowerment. They also need to fit in, but they also want to feel different. So some contradictions there that cause some conflict. And they're often stuck between two phases. So they feel adrift because they're actually moving away from childhood, and there's a rejection of anything that's perceived as childish, but they're also seeking something else, but they haven't actually found that thing yet. So that can leave them feeling quite alienated, and boredom can become, an often expressed experience for an adolescent, because they're rejecting things that may have interested them during middle childhood, but actually they haven't discovered yet how to replace those earlier hobbies, for example, or interests. And they're also very sensitive to peer perceptions and acceptance. We know that, and that's why social media can be so damaging for teenagers. Prone to embarrassment, they have this need for social approval, but actually they're going to make mistakes because they're learning. They're learning very much about the social world and how to be in it in a more independent way. And so it's easier for them to slip up. And there is this preference for spending time with peers, we know, and moving away from parents. And the peer group becomes incredibly important for the development of their identity, but also their independence and autonomy from the parents and the rest of the family. And also thinking about identity formation. And it's really key working with young people who are from a different ethnic group, for example, and how we might think about that as practitioners. How do we really empower them to see the importance of their cultural group to the development of their identity, and to integrate that into their identity development, particularly when they may be around peers who are not from a similar background to them. And so it becomes important to really help young people to take pride in their cultural experiences and their cultural group and their cultural values. I'm not going to go into this because of time, but Erik Erikson created his theory of child development, 7 stages of man psychosocial development. And these are really useful to think about in terms of the foundations that adolescents need to have had in early childhood in order to be able to navigate adolescence with strength and resilience. And for us to be resilient, there's a number of factors that are influential. We need to be resourceful. We need to be pretty good at problem solving. We need to have an awareness of our strengths and our assets. We need to be able to regulate our emotions, to bounce back from disappointment or failure, a sense of efficacy, which is knowing what we're good at, what we're capable of, ability to reach out to other people and engage and develop strong relationships, and having a sense of personal agency. And you can see from looking at this that vulnerable teenagers often lack most of those, or many of them, in terms of their own awareness. I mean, those strengths and assets are there. And, you know, they have resilience in the sense that they've survived those very difficult early experiences growing up, but they're not aware that they have all of these other capacities. And some of these other ones can be learned, like managing emotions and developing self-efficacy. So they need engaged adults in order for them to find those parts of themselves and to develop some of those skills that they might not have. And this is where it becomes difficult, because we know if there's been early trauma, then for adolescents, they may be operating from the more primitive parts of the brain. So the deeper primitive reptilian brain is very much concerned with safety. The question, am I safe? And all preoccupation becomes around that if that's not being satisfied in early development. And in the limbic system, it's about, am I loved and do I belong? So when a teenager is still preoccupied with these issues because their foundational development has been thwarted or impaired, then that means the higher level of the brain. So the part which is about learning and thinking and reflecting, problem solving, making judgments, impulse control, reading social cues, then it's much more difficult for the adolescent to function from that part of their brain, which can make it difficult for them to use certain approaches of working with them. For example, asking them to think about their behavior. If they're fairly much operating from here, that's going to be very challenging. I'll talk a bit about that in a little while. So the enduring impact of this, what we call developmental trauma, which is trauma that could begin in the womb, but certainly often begins once a baby's born. And these teenagers have difficulties with physiological and emotional regulation. The attachment strategy they've had to develop, if there's been a lot of risk around them and a lot of fear, will be shaped by danger and fear rather than safety and security. And there will be a lack of epistemic trust if there haven't been adults around for them who understand what they're going through and appreciate the challenges for them. Then it's very difficult for them to develop trust. And so they could, I think this is particularly important for teenagers who've experienced a lot of risk, because there's huge levels of mistrust. They don't trust the messages from the adults around them, the information about themselves or about the world. They often reject it. And sometimes the only information they take in is from that of their peers, or perhaps information that's appears on social media. And they often have distorted processing of cognition, so of cognitive information and affective information. And sometimes what happens is they may become dominant in terms of how they process information in one domain or another. So some young people may be fully dominant in cognitive processing and may struggle to become aware of their own emotions or the emotions of other people. Or some young people may be totally effectively dominant, in which case they're overwhelmed by their emotions all the time, and it's very difficult for them to think and reflect on them. And there may be, and there often is, problems with sense of self, a sound, solid sense of self. It may be distorted or disconnected. And often there are impaired social and relationships, because we learn how to relate to each other in a positive and safe and trusting way from our earliest experiences. And if the internal representations that the teenager carries are based on experiences of threat and fear and rejection, abuse, neglect, then it will make it more difficult for them to either have the skills to form relationships or to be able to trust somebody enough to allow relationships to develop. And also, this is quite key actually in understanding this when you're trying to work with teenagers who've experienced that level of trauma, that, and we ask them to account for themselves around their behavior. You know, why did that happen? Why, you know, I'm just wondering why you did that. And they might say, I don't know. And very often they don't, because behavior is driven by their implicit or procedural memories. And they're memories that are shaped right from infancy, that are not conscious to us. They're stored unconsciously, and they're often pre-verbal. So if we're operating from a primitive brain and we are reeling from trauma right from pre-birth or infancy, then behavior will be very much driven by those memories, and we won't be able to put any words to them or explain them. So just to talk now about how might we reach some of these adolescents who you know, can often present as vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, I don't mean downtrodden. I mean they may struggle with all of these necessary capacities for resilience. So starting with the community and starting with the family system is key with vulnerable young people, if we can actually reach out to the family to work with them. And this needs to be non-pathologizing. So talking to them about trauma and how trauma affects people, how it impairs people's functioning and an ability to be able to kind of reflect and recognize what's going on. And so we might talk about it in relation to toxic stress. What happens when we're stressed too much, too often, and for too long? And that's a more acceptable narrative for a lot of people than us trying to talk about their behavior or their parenting, for example. And trying to build the communities to support each other. So people in the community who can be kind of parent champions, for example, who can, you know, help the parent to build their capacities, because then the parent will be more able to build the child's capacity. And starting with individuals who have the trust of the parents and the children in the community, because very often these parents themselves have problems with epistemic trust, trusting information that comes from other people, people who they might see as different from themselves. So if we can engage and enlist people in the community who have that trust, it goes a long way. And helping these parents and children to find safe places. And that might come in a variety of different forms. So we talked about trust, and rather than focusing on parenting skills, talk to parents about relationships with their children, because when they hear the word parenting, it can be quite off-putting, or they might hold the assumption that they're going to be judged or criticized. And using creative tools with families, I find it goes a long way. You know, sometimes if we rely too much on language, language is processed by different parts of the brain, and it's more difficult to hold on to, particularly if you have receptive or expressive language difficulties. And, you know, we might have meetings with parents and feel that we've had this really good chat with them and that they've taken it in, and then they may come back the next week and it's like it's kind of, we either never had the conversation or they've lost it. And I think from my experience working with these families, I think we need to try and help them to take in this information in different ways. So using drawing and, you know, diagrams, mind maps, you know, whatever sorts of approaches you find comfortable to work with, it makes a big difference. And it's more easy, it's easier for the parents to hold on to some of those thoughts once we've kind of helped to make them more concrete for them through some sort of pictorial representation. And it's really important to, when people were trying to support people to recover from trauma, is to help them to reclaim narratives of empowerment, because they've often taken on narratives from other people that are extremely stigmatizing and disempowering, and can make it difficult for them to see a way out of their situation. And feeling empowered is one of the most important capacities we need in order to be able to overcome trauma. So these adolescents will come with these internal representations. So these are attachment experiences that get encoded in the brain in the form of mental representations. And these will guide the adolescent through relationships thereafter. You know, what they think about relationships, how they feel about relationships, whether they're able to use relationships. And some of those mental representations can be, you know, highly high risk in terms of their perception of what relationships bring to their lives. And so they're going to need a lot of help with changing some of those representations. And teenagers have also, always through history, somehow been perceived as adults, as problematic by adults. And this is a quote from Socrates, so we're going back a long time. Children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders. Children are now tyrants. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, and tyrannize their teachers. That could have been something that was written in the Daily Mail last weekend. So it's interesting. I find this really interesting that the perception that the adult world can have of adolescence. And it's almost like there's a kind of fear. And I wonder whether that comes from the challenges that adults bring to us personally, how they challenge us and how they challenge maybe a lot of the hypocrisy that they see in the world, and they're naming it, and that can feel very uncomfortable for the adult world. So adolescents may come to us, you know, when we're working with them, with a range of worldviews. And those worldviews will stem from those earliest experiences of safety or danger, and can really shape how the mind processes information, the brain and the mind processes information. And I found this really helpful when I worked with those teenagers in London, in trying to kind of get a sense of where they might be coming from. And so thinking about what their worldview might be, and that would be what they would be projecting out onto the world from the inside on the basis of their prior experience. So do they think the world is full of viable options and plenty of alternative choices? Or do they see the world as mysterious and frightening? Or do they see the world as tough and hard like a jungle? It's eat or be eaten. Or is the world seen as divinely controlled and guided with a distinct right and wrong according to a plan? Or might it seem to them like a habitat for all humanity to share together? And certainly that worldview will make a big difference, or have a big impact on how you approach the world and how you approach the people in it. And this is very much linked to the kind of perception of safety and danger that a young person might bring. And I haven't got a great deal of time to go into this at the moment, but I just wanted to mention about how early experiences of safety or danger shape how the brain and the body wires up, and how the vagus nerve functions. And the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve that starts in the primitive brain, and it connects to many different organs in the body. And it starts to be entrained or shaped from experience in infancy. And if a child has an experience of safety and nurture and consistent and relatively predictable caregiving, then the ventral vagus will develop around experiences of safety, which will influence what we call neuroception, so our detection of safety, and will mean that children and will grow up to be adolescents who actually are socially engaged, but also use social engagement and connection when they're upset or distressed or frightened or at risk in any way. Now, if that fails for infants and there isn't predictable, reliable, safe adults around, then the next option is to use fight-flight mechanisms in order to try and survive and feel safe. And so if that has been the only option for a young child, then they become a teenager who uses fight-flight mobilization in order to try and protect themselves. And if that fails, then the other part of the vagus nerve called the dorsal vagus is enlisted. And this is really this part of the nervous system should only be used for extreme survival, extreme life-saving shutdown. But in extreme stress and trauma, it actually becomes enlisted. And the brains of the nervous system of these children actually learns that immobilization, shutdown, and collapse is the only way to deal with this stress and trauma. And so that becomes entrained. So you may have a teenager who's escalates into fight-flight a lot, or they may be more likely to become immobilized in parasympathetic shutdown and collapse. And the challenge about actually developmental trauma is sometimes you will see that they will oscillate between the two. Sometimes it may be fight-flight, and sometimes they may go into shutdown. So when we're talking about how we support these young people, understanding this neuroception of psychological safety is absolutely key. So the neuroception is like a radar that we have inside of us that we're constantly using to monitor the environment, to detect if we're safe or if we're unsafe, or if there's some sort of threat. And if there's an absence of threat, then we will feel quite relaxed. If there's a mid-range threat, we'll be mobilized into more vigilance. And if there is extreme threat, then we will have to adopt some pretty extreme responses to protect ourselves. So the problem for teenagers who've experienced early trauma, right through their early infancy and childhood, is that the nervous system has been primed to respond in this way as a means of protecting them and helping them to survive. And so that perception of danger or lack of safety is kind of everywhere for them, even in safe places. So for example, they misread facial expressions. The neuroscience is telling us that. So even if you have a neutral face, the young person can see what they project actually is anger, for example, or disappointment. They will see something that maybe is not there. And we need to be very aware of this when we're talking to young people about their behavior. So it's important not to start with the behavior, but to think about how we connect first, because we need to bring that nervous system into a state of safety before we can talk to them about something that might have happened. And we also need to be very careful about how we talk to them about it using language. So avoiding blaming or lecturing. We need to approach it from a position of concern and recognition of their struggles, rather than actually, I need you to know, I need to kind of make it clear to you that you have done this thing wrong. So it's a different way of approaching some of these difficulties. And if you can present yourself as an ally in helping the young person to resolve their struggles, rather than focusing on the behavior, then, well, it certainly is important, because we know that behavior is communication, and it's very important not to address the behavior directly, but to think about what's actually going on underneath in order to help the child to change their behavior. So if you present yourself as an ally in helping them to resolve their struggles, then you gain their trust, and that in itself will help to relax the sense of fear and lack of threat in the nervous system. And when we are in that state of safety, we're open and curious. And that means we can also be open and curious about ourselves and about our own negative behavior. We're embodied, so we're not shut down. We're not kind of too much in fight or flight, or we're not too shut down. We're available to connect with another person and to perhaps hear what they have to say and to allow them to influence us. We're flexible in our behavior. And mostly what's most important here is that we feel and believe we have choices and options. So it makes it easier for us to be able to do the right thing. And so we need to become this sociostatic regulator that Cosolino talks about. Sociostatic regulation is how we as humans reciprocally influence each other, each other's physiology, psychology, and states of mind through our physical presence. So our hormonal systems, our biochemical systems, our energetic systems are constantly communicating with each other, although we can't see it. We have this powerful capacity to be able to influence a teenager's nervous system by using our own. And sometimes we can pick up really overwhelming feelings. Sometimes it can be unconsciously picked up from a child or a parent that can make us feel a bit overwhelmed. And so regulating ourselves becomes very important. So in the research, just want to check the time. In the qualitative research I mentioned earlier on, I talked about knowing our own ghosts, which is a key part of this work with traumatized individuals, because we need to be aware when perhaps their trauma is interfacing with ours and that we're getting triggered, that it's our issues that are getting triggered rather than something about the young person's behavior. And that might be triggering feelings in us, which is influencing our behavior. And that awareness is key so that we don't act out on those powerful triggers that can happen. And so thinking about your own regulation and how you regulate yourself first before you're going to need to regulate yourself first before you can regulate a traumatized teenager or an acting out teenager. And you have this system of neuroception just as they do. And if you are feeling threatened, then that's going to create an arousal in you, which will then influence the nervous system of the young person, even if you're not saying anything. This is how powerful this process is. So attending to our own regulation, breathing, grounding ourselves, kind of thinking about our own resources are all really important part of keeping your nervous system in a regulated state in the midst of the challenging work. And ultimately, what we want to do is to help lift that young person from operating in that very primitive brain state or the emotional brain state into being able to use their thinking and reflection in order to balance them more. So rather than being reactive, to being more responsive. And so let's think about some things that we can do around that. So I mentioned about talking about to young people about teenagers about their behavior. So we know that developmental trauma primes the brain for survival and self-protection. So that's where they're coming from. And remember those different worldviews that I mentioned earlier on. So they may be coming from one of those worldviews. No matter what you're saying in a moment, if that worldview predominates, then that's what's going to influence how they hear what you're saying. So there are these sensitivity to issues of power naturally within adolescence because of the unique stage of development. So there's a concern that adults might be trying to control them. And so therefore how we approach them is really key, because there's a fear that they'll lose that autonomy that they're trying so hard to develop. And they need to feel that they've got this agency. And so if we engage with them in ways that really reinforces that and empowers it for them, they're going to feel good with us. They're going to feel that we really are, we have their concerns, at the forefront of our minds, and that we're actively trying to honor that for them. And there's also a fear of negative judgment, because remember I said the brain, because it's developing, there's a difficulty with being able to manage and process some of that information in a balanced way, because it's almost like there's a really kind of sensitive nerve during adolescence around perceptions and judgments of other people. And so they're very fearful of the stigma of diagnosis and being judged by other people. You know, when I worked with these young people in London, I often didn't tell them I was a psychotherapist. I might say therapist, but psychotherapist is often a trigger because their automatic assumption was that they were psycho. There was something really badly wrong with them, that they might need somebody to help, you know, to kind of help them with their mental illness, because that was the perception that they held. So addressing that was really important in order to make it safe enough for young people to be able to engage in a relationship. And that's what it was about, really. It was about a relationship rather than me focusing too much on you know, my role or what I did, because unless we had the trust between us and the safety in the relationship, we weren't going to be able to do any work. And so this is a quote from Siegel, and I think it fits really nicely here. It says, our state of mind can turn even neutral comments into fighting words, distorting what we hear to fit what we fear. So that's the thing about the perception and the world views that are projected out, you know, and how things are kind of molded into our perception and how we think about ourselves and how we feel about ourselves. And if we don't change that sort of state of fearfulness, then it's very difficult for them to receive the messages in a way where they don't feel threatening. And this is a Portia's quote, which I really like. He says, when we're with significant others, the responsibility of that relationship is to keep our autonomic nervous system out of states of defense. So again, it's kind of thinking about the person's neuroception. Are they picking up, you know, if the radar is going, is it saying you're safe with this person? You know, you can trust this person. Okay, so just to talk about some more of the little kind of practical things that you can do to help young people when they have experienced trauma, and we're trying to somehow reach a place with them in a relationship where they feel they can trust us enough to begin to talk about things that have happened. This is from Dan Siegel, the Imagine Your Hand as a Brain diagram, and I just find this brilliant. I use this with children, adolescents, and parents, and some of you may be familiar with it already, but it's very, very simple and handy to use a joke. So you've got here, this part is the limbic system. So you've got the amygdala and the hippocampus, and then you've got this part which represents the cerebral cortex. You've got the brainstem down here. So it's a really nice way of talking to a young person about what might happen in their brain when they're angry or when they're upset or when they're afraid, and to explain it so that this is what happens in your brain and your body, of course, so that they can understand what happens inside of them. And it's a really nice way of addressing some of the stigma that they feel about their behavior and about their feelings and about the whole sense of overwhelm that they feel. And also, children who've experienced trauma often feel like there's something very wrong with them. They feel very different, and that's because of the whole impact of the trauma on their social, emotional, physiological, and their nervous system. So if we can use approaches that help to normalize that, you know, when this happens to children, this is what happens to their brain. This part becomes very, very loud and active because it's trying to keep the person safe. Or you might say, this will happen to your brain because you had to keep yourself safe because there wasn't somebody else available to do that for you. And it just means that you haven't yet developed this part of your brain, which is about thinking and stopping yourself, you know, when you're feeling angry. So really trying to help them to understand through psychoeducation what trauma is and how it affects their brain and body. And here's another one that I often use, which teenagers, younger children can understand this as well. And even sometimes I use it with parents. So imagining your brain as a car and the engine or the accelerator as the where you actually, because it kind of veers out of control, that you don't have the capacity to be able to put the brakes on. So, and this is the immature brake system, which is the prefrontal cortex. And I often say to young people, if you're in a car, would you prefer to be in the driver's seat or the passenger seat? And adolescents say, definitely, I want to be in the driver's seat. So then we would talk about, okay, so perhaps I can help you with that, to be able to put the brakes on so the car doesn't veer out of control. It's a really simple and again, a destigmatizing way of talking about stress in the brain and the functioning of the amygdala. Particularly, we talk about the alarm system, which is the amygdala here, and I liken that to an alarm in a house, or either a burglar alarm or a fire alarm, and that will go off if you're feeling stressed or threatened or fearful. And that's quite natural because that's what keeps us safe. So these explanations are really helpful. Or you could use figures of puppets. I often use an alligator reptile figure for the primitive brain to talk about emotional triggers or triggers of fear and what happens to us when we need to protect ourselves. We go into fight or flight, or we might go into shut down or freeze. And the owl puppet as the prefrontal cortex, as the wise part that's able to think and reflect. And you may be able to use figures which represent that sort of rageful, angry part of them that needs to express itself. And you can think about that part. Okay, that's a really powerful part. And, you know, I can see how that's protected you. It's been very important for you. It's very important to validate those defenses that these young people have, because that's what's helped them to survive. So I can see that's a really powerful figure, and it's really helped you to survive and to protect yourself. But I wonder, you know, what is it about that figure that had to become so big and so powerful? What is it? Why did that have to happen? What is it that you didn't get, that you needed? And so you can begin to engage a young person in conversation that way. And then other approaches we can use around creating body confidence, competence, using sensory approaches. So the sensory approaches would be about regulation. So trying to help the young person to calm down if they're feeling really anxious or feeling really angry. So you can use different foods like crunchy foods, foods that are really chewy. You can use drinks that are thick, so liquids that you drink through a straw, like hot chocolate or thick yogurts. They can really help to regulate when the young person's feeling angry. I'm just thinking about a young person I'm working with who contacted me from the UK, who I worked with in the same charity I mentioned earlier on a few years ago. And she's an adult now. She's come back and asked me to do some more work with her. And she's very resourceful, but she's had ongoing problems with anger. And to the point where she can actually become really, have aggressive, threatening outbursts in public if somebody approaches her in a particular way. So that's could potentially be a very threatening situation, and she has been arrested once for it. So it's obviously not good for her to be in that situation. But one of the things I recommended to her was to carry toffees in her bag. Now that might seem like a really strange thing, but that could make the difference for her in that moment where she's starting to kind of feel really wound up, and the risk is that she's going to escalate and she's going to do something that actually, you know, she believes lets her down. She talked about letting herself down. So she doesn't want this to happen, but something takes over her in that moment. And so something as simple of having toffees can make a difference. So using tactile experiences, smell that are comforting, that feel safe, sounds that are calming, that might equate to an experience that was once very safe and calming. Similarly with visual, with images. And then, so things that kind of bring in rhythm, like drumming or rocking or swinging, dancing, doing yoga, these are all very helpful to regulate the nervous system. Any sport is really helpful to try and get that young person grounded in their bodies, but just be aware too much activity might drive some teenagers into being over aroused. And then martial arts, also very good. So other things that you can do is ask the young person to tell you about a time that they felt good, something, they might have a positive memory or something good happened to them. And if you can get them to think about that, actually bring that up visually in their minds and to tell you, so to describe it, maybe what can they see? Are there any colors? Are there any smells? Are there any textures? And that's all important because they're important cues for the experience. And the more that you can kind of embed them and reinforce them, the more helpful it is as a resource. And if you get them to remember that time or that experience, then you can anchor it with maybe doing some, we'd use the butterfly tapping, butterfly dance, some people call it, where you cross your arms over and you alternatively tap on each side of the arm. And what that does is it reinforces that memory for the young person. You might do a calm place visualization. Some people do this, they call it the safe place, but I've found extremely traumatized children, actually this can be a trigger for them because there is no safe place inside. So I try and talk about finding a calm place. So it may be difficult for them to imagine a calm place. And so you might need to help them to find one through, you know, getting to draw a picture with you and then see if they can actually internalize it. And if they can, then asking them to move through it with you. What can they see? What can they hear? What can they smell? What can they taste? What can they feel? So anchoring those visualizations in the senses is really powerful and really helpful, because then you can try and evoke it again at a time when you're not feeling safe or not feeling comfortable. Ask them to connect to a memory of someone they love or admire. And this could be a family friend or a family member, a friend, a professional. It could be somebody who's deceased. It could be a grandparent, for example, that they had a really close relationship with, or it could be a fantasy figure. And, you know, maybe you could help them to think about what that person might say about them, or what sort of messages that they can take from that person that would help them to see the qualities in them, and how that person might help them to feel empowered. You know, we've got animals, they can choose a power, what we call a power animal, and then that becomes the animal which represents, for them, represents power, and you can help them to work with that. It could also be superheroes. And of course, the arts are just an amazing, amazing tool for helping traumatized children and adolescents to be able to access their strengths, but also other aspects of their experience that they might want to share. And there are numbers of different ways that we can do that. So here are a couple of little creative things that I recommend you could do. Just to be aware that talking about trauma and traumatic experiences is actually very difficult when you don't have any safety and stability inside. And with children who've experienced extreme trauma, they need a lot of resourcing, a lot of building up, a lot of regulation, a lot of grounding before they're ready to go to the traumatic memories. So I suggest you try and do a lot of that work with them first. And this is a little image which, you know, ask them to think about their dreams. Something is benign. I mean, it's not going to be benign for all teenagers, but for many it will be. It's not too challenging, and helping them to embellish that dream can be really helpful to give them something to hold on to for the future. And a little technique I sometimes use is I actually get them to draw it and then ask them to I say, well, okay, we're 20 years down the road now, and this has happened for you. And I interview them and ask them about how it came about, who are the people that help them along the way? What are they doing now? So, you know, where are they living? What kind of a house are they in? Are they married, or are they have a partner, or, you know, what's going on in their life right now? And that starts to embellish it for them. And it creates a kind of representation in the brain, even though it hasn't happened, because they visualized it. It can really help to somehow have the creation of the possibility. It's like a rehearsal of the future, or or possibilities for them, a way of seeing themselves in the future that is different from the past that they've had. And often teenagers are very anxious about talking about themselves and about their emotions. And I find using these little strategies helpful, so that they can actually monitor them. They can actually control themselves, how much they talk. So we ask them to tell us what feels safe. So is it that, you know, you show me the green light and you say, that's fine, we can chat away about that. Or amber is, this is getting a bit difficult, I'm not sure. And red is too much. So you could have these, you know, printed out, and beg your pardon, you could have these printed out and use them when you're having those discussions with the young person. And then there's use of social media. I don't mean directly, but you could ask a young person, if you're trying to get to know them, if they were to put a profile on Facebook, what would they say about themselves? And then you could get them to write that when they're with you. And that would be a really nice way of getting to know them better. And I quite like this. There's loads of resources on the internet that you can find. And for many of these young people, they just don't know. They don't have options. They don't know what to do if they're upset, or if they're distressed, or they're angry. And having a little something like a visual graphic like this, very simple, but can be very helpful. It doesn't mean they're going to be able to do these things. When there's been a lot of extreme trauma and there's a lack of safety inside, actually one of the challenges for young people is being able to adopt these interventions and resources that we might offer them. So that means they need a lot of foundational support, regulation of their primitive brain system before they can go on to being able to do these things for themselves. So a lot of co-regulation from us through that process. And so these are just a couple of examples of things you can find on the internet that are quite nice ways of getting young people to talk about themselves. And some will be able to engage with these more than others. I like this particularly for teenagers, the angry iceberg, and it really helps them to understand that actually anger is a surface emotion, and that very often underneath there's all sorts of other emotions that they might be struggling with, but might make them too vulnerable to talk about. So it can be a way of working towards the awareness of that for them. Okay, so I'm going to just stop there, because we're going to have some time for questions before we end. So I'm going to just hand over to Christina for that.
Hi, Christina. Thanks a million for that. So much information to process, and some really useful ideas there, just thinking about how we can work with adolescents, some of the ways we can talk, and some of the strategies and tools that we can use in doing that. So before we move into the Q&A, I just want to formally thank you, Christina, for both inputs. On behalf of the Mental Health and Wellbeing subgroup of CYPSC, thank you very much. So I'm going to stop recording now, and I'm going to open up for Q&A, if that's okay.